Hello, this is Phil Tomzak, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the June 19th issue of the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And let's start with some front page news from the Star, news from the GTA. Teen is guilty of murder in execution of random stranger outside New York high-rise. Crown may seek an adult sentence. And this comes from Betsy Powell, courts reporter for The Star. Close to midnight on June 24th, 2024, four masked gunmen jumped out of a stolen Acura sedan and ran toward a gazebo near a Falstaff Avenue high-rise, firing shots at the small group of strangers gathered inside. When the occupants fled, three of the shooters ran back to the vehicle, while the fourth, a 14-year-old boy who had sprinted ahead of them and narrowly avoided their gunfire, broke off and began chasing down a man riding a scooter. When 20-year-old A.J. Simpson realized what was happening, he threw down the scooter and ran for his life. When it appeared he might escape, the teen slowed down, aimed, and fired three shots, one striking Simpson in the leg. The boy then approached, and as Simpson lay helpless on the ground, fired five more shots at close range, killing the young father, who told his family he envisioned his 3-month-old daughter becoming a WNBA star. Ultimately, there was no motive other than it appears the gunmen were bent on intimidating the Jane Falstaff neighborhood where Simpson lived. The group did not know him. Prior to the shooting, they circled the area looking for targets before the shocking attack was caught on surveillance video outside the high-rise complex. Despite this, in a Toronto court on Thursday, the teen's judge decided he could not find enough evidence of planning and deliberation for a first-degree murder conviction. He instead convicted the teen, who is now 16, of second-degree murder. At the start of his trial earlier this year, the teen tried to plead guilty to the lesser murder charge, but his plea was rejected by the prosecutor, who opted to go ahead with a trial under the Youth Criminal Justice Act, the YCGA. The trial was held in front of the Superior Court Justice Peter Bawden, whose task was to consider whether this was a case of first or second-degree murder. There was no jury. Immediately after killing Simpson, the 14-year-old ran back to the waiting Acura, which sped away. The teen was arrested soon after. The other shooters were not. On Thursday, at the outset of reading a shortened version of his judgment, Bawden explained that although the Supreme Court of Canada has settled the definition of what constitutes planning and deliberation, recent case law demonstrates there can be significant differences of opinion, even among experienced judges, as to what evidence is sufficient to establish planning and deliberation. In this case, Bawden said while he is satisfied the youth likely intended to kill the first person he encountered as he ran toward the gazebo, quote, "The random and chaotic nature of the offense is, in my view, difficult to reconcile with the elements of a planned and deliberate murder." In addition, the fact that the accused was only 14 at the time of the offense is an inescapable part of the factual matrix. Our law has long recognized that young people have a reduced capacity for moral judgment, he said, adding that an important element of deliberation is the ability to consider the moral consequences of carrying out a planned murder. There was also evidence that he acted impulsively and exercised poor judgment, such as placing himself directly in the line of fire of his three associates. At the end of Thursday's brief proceeding, the judge turned to the victim's family seated in the gallery and said he hoped they would not see the verdict as a failure of the justice system, nor as diminishing the significance of the young man's death. "I share your outrage," Bawden told them, adding he had to make a legal finding based on what was proven beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution has filed a notice indicating an adult sentence will be sought. The maximum sentence for a young person convicted of second-degree murder under the YCGA is 7 years. If sentenced as an adult, a life sentence is mandatory. The teen's identity remains covered under a publication ban that will expire if he is sentenced as an adult. He returns to court later this year to begin the multi-stage sentencing phase. And our next front page story, news from Canada. It has the headline, Canada gave these former refugees a chance. Now they're pushing back against anti-refugee claims. And this comes from Nicholas Kyung, senior immigration reporter for the Toronto Star. Canada opened the door to Asma Faizi and her family after the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, forcing them to flee to neighboring Pakistan and later India. She was 8 when she was resettled in Toronto with her parents and 2 siblings in the dead of winter in 1986 as government-sponsored refugees. After a brief stay at a downtown hotel, they moved into social housing in Scarborough. Her father, despite a university degree, worked as a security guard and drove a taxi to support the family. Even when he struggled to make ends meet, his kids' education came first. Faizi and her older brother would become lawyers, and the youngest sibling ended up in business. I'm a prime example of what refugees bring to Canada, said Faizi, president of the Canadian Council for Refugees. We have taken the opportunities that have been offered to us through Canada and the people here, and we've contributed back to the society. While success stories like hers are common, she said they have been overshadowed by narratives in recent years that portray refugees as a drain on Canada rather than contributors. The surge of refugees in the country is just a reflection of the rising global displacement as a result of wars and unrest, she noted. A 2024-25 public opinion poll by the Immigration Department found that just a third of Canadians felt that the impact of refugees on Canada was positive. 48% of respondents said Canada was admitting too many asylum seekers, while 41% said the country was resettling too many refugees from abroad. Just over half agreed that accepting refugees is part of Canada's humanitarian tradition. The more you feed into this negative narrative, the more fearful society and the politicians become, and the more restrictive these policies become, said Faizi, who was a corporate lawyer specializing in intellectual property rights before switching to refugee law in 2021. That's why the Council has launched a week of action to highlight refugee contributions and show solidarity across Canada with them, leading up to the World Refugee Day on Saturday. It comes in the wake of Ottawa's new law to restrict eligibility for asylum and rules to limit health care coverage for refugees. The campaign, including an open letter to Prime Minister Mark Carney, highlighting local events organized by its 200-member organizations across Canada and a toolkit to promote the message, "We are better together," also followed a report released by UNHCR Canada in early June that looked at the social and economic benefits of welcoming displaced people in need of protection. Refugees' earnings in Canada. Based on data from the Immigration Department and Statistics Canada, the report found that refugee income does grow steadily as individuals establish their roots. A decade after arrival, refugees saw their median employment earnings rose by 31.5%, from $25,400 to $33,400 in the 2022 tax year. The report said most refugees come to Canada early in their lives, and 3/4 of them are of working age, between 15 and 64. They are also more likely to work in trades, transport, and equipment operation, manufacturing and the utilities sector, healthcare, and the sales and service industry, filling the backbone roles in the economy. Abdul Al-Kaf was studying industrial engineering at Penn State University in the U.S. on a full scholarship when civil war broke out back home in Yemen. With the Muslim ban in place during President Donald Trump's first term, he had nowhere to go and crossed into Canada seeking asylum in 2019. The 31-year-old, now a Canadian citizen, found a job counting inventory in retail within weeks of arrival before he started working in the refugee support sector. People think that refugees are sucking off the system and staying on welfare for years, said Elkoff, now a senior manager at Matthew House, Ottawa. Many are highly educated and skilled with a lot of experience. Some refugees, like Tabisha Esperance, also bring their entrepreneurial spirit to Canada. The Congolese woman, The Congolese woman spent 9 years at the Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya before she and her family were resettled here by the Canadian government in 2019. At the camp, she honed her skills as a designer and seamstress to make traditional African clothes. What I can do with my hands can feed me, said the 33-year-old mother of 4, who now runs a custom clothing brand from her home in Cambridge, Ontario. Not everyone is that lazy immigrant who saw the opportunity of coming to Canada and enjoying the government benefits. People are working so hard. I've met refugees who have done wonders, she says. Let's move on to our next front page story, breaking news. The headline, Frank Stronach guilty on 2 charges at Toronto sex assault trial. Billionaire is acquitted on rape allegations. This story comes from our courts reporter, Betsy Powell. Frank Stronach, a billionaire businessman and recipient of the Order of Canada, has been found guilty of 2 charges related to a series of historical sexual assault allegations, but has been acquitted on the allegation he committed a violent rape. There are a lot of issues to cover, Superior Court Justice Anne Malloy said, beginning to read from her decision convicting Stronach on 2 incidents involving 2 different women in the 1970s and 80s. When the trial opened in mid-February, 7 women were accusing Stronach of sexual assault dating back to the 1970s. He faced 12 charges, several of them laid under the old criminal code provisions that existed before 1983, when offenses such as rape and indecent assault were replaced by the broader category of sexual assault. But as the evidence unfolded over weeks, the Crown's case fell apart under intense cross-examination, forcing prosecutors to withdraw 5 counts mid-trial. Furthermore, Malloy said she could not convict on 2 charges relating to the first woman to testify, saying her evolving narrative made it impossible for me to know what happened. She alleged Stronach sexually assaulted her on a dance floor and that she woke up to find him on top of her engaging in sexual intercourse. By the end of the trial, the most serious remaining allegations involved a woman who claimed Stronach violently raped her in a downtown hotel room sometime between 1980 and 1982. Malloy acquitted Stronach on those charges. Stronach will remain on bail ahead of sentencing hearings to be held in September. About 45 minutes before the proceeding began, the 93-year-old arrived at the downtown Toronto courthouse. Stronach, who walked slowly with his hands behind his back, was accompanied by his security detail, an ex-police officer who was by his side throughout the trial, his lawyer, Leora Shemesh, and one of her associates. Stronach did not testify at trial. At the end of the case, prosecutors Jelena Vlacic and Julia Belohumur argued they had proven the 5 remaining charges related to 3 women beyond a reasonable doubt, while the defense urged Superior Court Justice Anne Malloy to acquit Stronach of the remaining charges. The Crown's case was built on a toxic combination of unreliable witnesses, a lack of physical evidence, decades of delay, and a deeply flawed police investigation, defense lawyer Shemesh said in her final arguments. In addition, Stronach had been subjected to public vilification, creating a highly prejudicial environment that undermined his presumption of innocence. She also suggested there were clear, plausible motives for the women to fabricate the allegations, including potential financial incentives. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. On to our next story, news from the GTA. It has the headline, Rogers says it warned City News reporter about disobeying the company's journalistic standards before she was fired. And this is written by Ghada Al-Sharif, immigration and work reporter for the Star. Rogers Communications has accused former City News political reporter Tina Yazdani of failing to uphold the company's journalistic standards despite formal warnings, arguing it had just cause to terminate her employment, according to a statement of defense filed Thursday in response to her $650,000 wrongful dismissal lawsuit. Rogers alleges Yazdani manipulated video footage and social media content in ways that misrepresented the facts and portrayed speakers in a negative light, despite receiving feedback and warnings from managers. In its statement of defense, the company said 4 incidents between December 2025 and April 2026 demonstrated a pattern of misconduct that led them to conclude Yazdani was unable or unwilling to comply with Rogers' journalistic standards. Yazdani, who's 36 and was fired last April, was based at Queen's Park and had been employed by City News for 8 years. In her statement of claim filed on May 28th, she alleged that her firing amounted to a wrongful termination after new management took issue with her confrontational style with politicians in the Ontario government. Yazdani said she followed all established editorial processes and that her actions were neither insubordinate nor reckless and do not remotely approach the high bar required to justify summary dismissal for cause. Her claim is seeking 18 months of lost salary, $500,000 in total damages, and the cost of legal fees. In its statement of defense, Rogers outlines specific incidents, including a December 2025 story in which Yazdani attended a press conference in Buffalo with Premier Doug Ford shortly after the Integrity Commissioner launched an investigation into the Skills Development Fund. The company accused Yazdani of filing 2 stories that centered entirely on Premier Ford's alleged refusal to answer her question, and chased him, asking him to answer her question. Rogers claimed Yazdani framed the entire story around the Premier's alleged refusal to answer her question on the investigation, when the question had already been asked by another reporter. These stories violated the company's news policy because Ford, quote, did not in fact refuse to take questions, Rogers said. Yazdani's claim in May said she was sent with instructions to ask about the fund, but was unsuccessful and instead captured footage of her trying to get the Premier's attention. According to her claim, her subsequent story aired but was later pulled from the station's website without explanation. She alleged she received a formal written warning, despite the story going through the standard editorial process. On March 25, 2026, Yazdani was in a scrum with Education Minister Paul Calandra when he told her not to interrupt him, an exchange she included in her story because it provided essential context about the minister's demeanor. 2 days after the scrum, she alleges she was called into another meeting with management and told that including the clip was a serious breach of journalistic standards and a violation of Rogers' news policy. Yazdani was fired a week later, on April 2nd. Rogers alleged Yazdani gave instructions to edit the video footage in a manner that served to intentionally characterize Calandra in a negative light, and to make it appear as though he was answering a different question, which had been asked by Yazdani earlier in the media scrum. This violated their news policy, the company said. On March 6, 2026, Rogers alleged that Yazdani posted an Instagram video in response to public criticism of City News coverage of a Queen's Park OSAP rally. The company said the post edited together clips from previous stories, intending to showcase Yazdani being critical of the Ford government and other elected and public officials, and included clips of political leaders where the correct context was not maintained. Rogers claimed the senior editorial team directed Yazdani to remove the post because it did not meet the company's editorial standards. Rogers alleges she refused and continued to push back during several lengthy discussions with managers before removing it and the instruction of the news director. Yazdani's lawyer, Catherine Marshall, rejected the allegations in Rogers' statement of defense. Rogers' allegations are categorically false, she said in the statement, entirely without merit and are not supported by the facts or the editorial record, Marshall said in an emailed statement to the Star on Thursday night. At no point did my client manipulate video or audio in any way, nor did she ever misrepresent any speaker or alter the meaning of any exchange. Marshall noted that all content produced was reviewed and approved through Rogers' own editorial chain before broadcast. Rogers is asking the court to dismiss the lawsuit. Let's continue with a couple of stories around the World Cup. The first headline, Canada's win over Qatar brought an avalanche of emotion and a new purpose to the World Cup mission. Excuse me, this is a special to the Star from Joe Callahan. Vancouver. Moise Bombito knows a bad break. His return from his own leg fracture to make his first World Cup appearance was exactly 6 minutes old when he saw and likely heard the familiar, sickening sound. It took his fellow Montrealer Ismail Kone from this World Cup, and so Bombito felt like the right man to bring Canada back together again. First, they had to face down even more shameful Qatari goading. Coach Yulen Lopetegui and his players leaving here with little credit, though Marsh did confirm that Asim Madibo later came to Canada's dressing room to apologize for the tackle on Kone. But then Canada's players and staff coalesced around Bombito, and he rallied them all in something that looked both solemn and stirring. When the circle broke to go on a most deserved lap of celebration, the wild joy and torn emotions pouring out of Coach Jesse Marsh, one Canadian left his teammates to do their thing. Alphonso Davies went off and started doing full-pitch shuttle runs, mixing in sprints. Marsh later said that no Canadian will ever forget this day. That it ended with Davies stretching his sinews for the days to come said more than all of the words Canadians offered when they came through the mixed zone. Against a lamentably limited Qatari outfit, Canada's historic first World Cup win was a landslide. But there was an avalanche of emotion out there in the green middle of a red cauldron. The emotion carried into post-game thoughts. In different turns of phrase and reflection, an unsurprising theme bound them all. Whatever comes next, they'll be doing it for Kone. To make it such a beautiful day for Canada, Captain Stephen Eustachio said, but at the same time, you feel so empty after what happened with Ismail. It's so unfortunate. We love him like he's family. We just have to continue. He's going to want us to win the next match, and that's what we're going to try and do for him. These are not just honorable, but ultimately empty words. The brotherhood of this squad is deep and true. Yet, doing it for Kone is all well and good. The more pressing question is, can they do it without him? Until the fateful moment befell him, the 24-year-old was enjoying another sumptuous outing. Fresh from his man-of-the-match master class against Bosnia-Herzegovina, he was putting in another Rolls-Royce of a midfield display. Never rushed, always finding space. Now the space left behind feels like a giant chasm. I don't think we have another player like Ismail, Marsh responded to a query from the Star afterward. He's a bit of an X factor for us. We're going to miss him. We can use different guys in different ways, but no one in the same way. This was a West Coast afternoon for the ages that began so well and then, in that flash, turned into something almost operatic. The sight of Kone on the sidelines, giving the Canadian public here and across the land the thumbs up from his stretcher, and then dropping his left shoulder and head into the chest of Marsh, a man who has made Kone's development this year such a passion project, will live long in the memory. How many memories can they make in his absence? Canada is all but guaranteed knockout football. A win against Switzerland next Wednesday would see it top the group and stay here, the country surely coming more and more on board after the storyline takes such cinematic twists. An irony? On social media, Kone calls himself Hollywood IK. Scriptwriters would earn a raise from this one. Nathan Saliba, another of the Montreal Brigade who are so close to one another, came in for Kone and started the healing process by scoring the fourth. He ran to the sidelines to raise the number 8 jersey, and he's the most likely candidate to fill the midfield shirt alongside Eustachio against the Swiss and whoever comes next. Nathan came on and scored, and the first thing he's thinking about is Isma, reflected Alistair Johnston, fresh from a totemic personal display, but only thinking of the collective. This team really is a brotherhood, and it's really difficult to see one of your brothers go down. But look, if we needed any extra motivation for this tournament, we got it now. If Saliba covers some of Kone's work, more dogged and dynamic work in the heart of this Canada team, he is unlikely to also make up for the loss of creativity. Kone's combination of all of the above is that X factor. Enter Davies. As he sprinted up and down a piece of grass he knows so well, the prospect of he, like Bombito, returning from long-term injury to now play a major part in this journey loomed large. The further we go in this tournament, Marsh said, the more time we give to get Alfonso back to 100%, which we know will be an important thing for our team to be successful. They've already been successful, of course. Greater heights are now the target. They no longer have Kone, but they have one hell of a purpose. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. In our next story on the World Cup, the headline is How a Border Collie named Sally is Helping the World Cup with its Canada Goose Problem. A story from Sadine Mohsen, staff reporter for The Star. Centennial Park may be the city's official training site for World Cup athletes, but at any given moment, it's a 2-year-old named Sally who's the key player on this pitch. Sporting a neon green vest, Sally crouches down, fixing her intense gaze on her target before suddenly advancing. But her target is not a soccer ball, it's a gaggle of Canada geese. And Sally is a border collie, one of several bird dogs trained to keep the birds away from the Etobicoke field where the international soccer stars are currently training. At first, the pesky birds creep away from Sally, despite her stalking them and fixing them with her intense collie eyes stare. But then she picks up the pace and runs after the birds, who decide to make a hasty getaway, wings flapping as they take flight and disappear into the sky. As anybody who has ever visited a Toronto park realizes, Canada geese are famous for at least one thing, leaving their droppings everywhere. More than just a nuisance, their feces could also create a slippery field for the high-performing athletes and can also carry toxic bacteria and parasites that can cause illnesses such as diarrhea and vomiting. Not ideal during a globally renowned soccer tournament. The players in the World Cup need to train on grass that is consistent, according to Katarina Jordan, director of the University of Guelph Turfgrass Institute. Geese feces could also burn the turf, she said, killing the grass and leaving behind yellow patches. It's enough to create a temporary void until the turf is filled back in. Even just allowing geese to land and feed on the grass can lead to uneven wear and tear, as well as weed encroachment, she added. Sally and other bird dogs are trained to stalk the geese and herd the birds away from the fields, just as they would with other types of livestock, such as cattle and sheep. said Gareth Williams, owner and operator of Border Control Bird Dogs, the specialized geese management company that employs Sally and 4 other working dogs. Through this method, the geese believe the dogs are predators and are re-educated to avoid the field. It's a humane and ecologically friendly way of doing it, he said. We're just fighting nature with nature. The City of Toronto contracted Williams to provide humane bird control services at Centennial Park during the World Cup tournament under a contract valued at $18,000. Williams' company did a similar job in Toronto during the 2015 Pan Am Games. His client list includes golf courses, cemeteries, municipalities who use his services for such locations as city parks, stormwater ponds, universities, and hospitals. Sally is the dog in charge at Centennial Park, as one border collie is capable of moving thousands and thousands of geese, according to Williams. But a backup, 8-year-old Ben, is on deck in case she needs reinforcement. Williams and his dogs usually arrive at the park at different times of day in order to throw off the birds, who could start learning the dog's patterns. They could just come when they know we're not there, said Williams. They're pretty smart. Border Collies, a sought-after breed for their shepherding skills with various livestock, are an ideal choice for the task at hand, said Sean Jordan, Turfgrass Research Facility Manager at the University of Guelph. It typically takes 6 months to a year to train Border Collies on how to gently herd and stay calm around geese. Sally has been herding geese full-time for about a year and Ben for about 5 years. Just like the rest of us, Border Collies yearn for a sense of purpose in life, according to Jordan, who calls the breed working dogs that need a task to feel happy and fulfilled. You're literally giving a dog that needs a job, a job. On now to sporting news. In an article on the Leafs, the headline is, The Maple Leafs land a defenseman Radish in sign and trade with the Lightning. And this comes from the Canadian Press. Toronto. The Toronto Maple Leafs acquired defenseman Darren Radish from the Tampa Bay Lightning on Friday in exchange for a 5th-round pick in the 2026 NHL Draft. The 30-year-old Toronto native signed an 8-year contract extension. Financial terms were not disclosed, but the deal is reportedly worth more than $8 million U.S. annually. Radish is coming off a breakout 2025-26 season, recording career highs with 22 goals and 70 points in 73 games. His previous career high was 37 points in 73 games with Tampa Bay in 2024-25. Darren has emerged as one of the NHL's premier two-way defensemen, combining elite puck-moving ability with poise, competitiveness, and strong play in all 3 zones, Leafs general manager John Chayka said in a release. He strengthens our blue line in every situation and is exactly the type of player we want helping lead this team. Radish had 35 goals and 143 points in 249 career games with Tampa Bay and was set to become an unrestricted free agent on July 1st. Undrafted following 5 seasons with the OHL's Erie Otters, Radish signed with the Chicago Blackhawks in 2018 and spent parts of 6 seasons in the American Hockey League before becoming an NHL regular. This report by the Canadian Press was first published today, June 19th, 2026. In our next story, an opinion piece from Star columnists, and it has the headline, I was there at Donald Trump's White House prize fight. It was more than just obscene. And this comes from Richard Warnica, senior opinion writer for the Star. Josh Hokett, a 231-pound former NFL fullback, stepped off his back foot, spun from his hips, and slammed his right fist into the opponent's left ear. The impact sounded wet and sharp as it echoed over the White House lawn. In the massive crowd just meters to the south, tens of thousands of mostly young, mostly men, oohed as Hokit stepped in and swung again. He hit his foe, a larger man named Derek the Black Beast Lewis, with a left hand to the face, then another behind his ear. Crack! And another, before Lewis, stiff-legged and wobbling, toppled to the floor of the chain-link cage. The referee stepped between the two men. Hokit swaggered away. His chest heaved. He walked out, still topless, glistening in the 30-degree heat, to the ringside seats where he shook hands with the President of the United States. I spent most of the week last week in Washington, D.C., around the fighters, trainers, and promoters of the Ultimate Fighting Championship. On Sunday, Trump's 80th birthday, I stood alongside 80,000 UFC fans watching 14 men beat each other bloody inside a cage built on the south lawn of the White House, next to where Jackie Kennedy's Rose Garden used to be. Even before the first bone was broken, the UFC's White House event had become the ultimate Rorschach test for the Trump era. To the president's base, it was a tribute to American values, a free event on public land celebrating masculinity, combat, commerce, and the country's upcoming 250th birthday. To his detractors, the whole thing was sacrilege. It was, in the words of a lawsuit aimed at stopping the event, a volcano of corruption, or, as the members of one PBS panel called it, a degrading spectacle and a sign of America's cultural decline. Having been there myself, I can report that UFC 250 Freedom, as it was billed, was about the worst thing it could have been for an opinion writer. A little of both. The event was obviously violent. That's kind of the point. Ilia Topuria, a handsome Spanish-Georgian lightweight, was so badly disfigured in his fight that by the end he could no longer see out of either eye. It was also at times garish and obscene. After shaking Trump's hand and putting a chain around his neck, Hokit walked back into the cage, took the microphone from Joe Rogan, and called Michelle Obama a man. You can't downplay that kind of gutter racism and sexism, not toward the country's only black first lady, not ever, but especially not at what used to be her home. At the same time, I came away from the UFC event convinced that at least some of the outside criticism was overblown. The event held Sunday was not some epochal break with American norms, and I think at least some of the people arguing it was are doing so not from a place of legitimate political grievance, but out of what amounts to cultural snobbery. They believe, whether consciously or not, that they are just better than the kinds of people who like watching men fight in a cage. I flew into D.C. on the Wednesday morning before the fights, at the start of a heat wave that would turn the city into a swamp of sticky air and human sweat. From the airport, I took the metro directly to a 4-star hotel 2 blocks from the White House, where the 14 athletes were facing the fight media one by one. From behind the stage, a hulking man in stars and stripes gloves staggered performatively to the podium. He wore a black toque pulled down over his eyes. "Oh, bleep, dog," he said in a cringingly bad Hispanic accent. That was my introduction to Josh Hokit. He was, I would later learn, doing a character, one of several desperately unfunny bits he would pull as the week went on. It was obvious from the bored silence that, to the regular UFC media, Hokit's shtick was nothing new. "Derek Lewis, I'm going to have him kidnapped by a group of mimes," he said about his opponent. After the fight, he planned to take my pants off and get on the microphone, throw the cup at Donald Trump. He laughed awkwardly at his own failed joke. He was the only one. Beyond Hokit, what struck me most about the interviews was how many of the fighters and the journalists seemed to be trying to avoid the obvious political overtones of the event. Justin Gaethje, the American lightweight who would go on to break both of Topuria's orbital bones on Sunday, seemed increasingly frustrated by even the blandest questions he faced about fighting at the White House. "I'm walking into a cage against a guy that's trying to hurt me very badly," he said at one point. "None of those things really matter." It was a strange and persistent dynamic. Almost every one of the dozens of UFC fans I spoke to in Washington told me that while they thought it was cool that the fights were at the White House, they were there primarily for the fights, not the White House, let alone the Trumpian politics at play. And yet, inevitably, the politics kept seeping in. On Friday, before driving to a public press conference at the Lincoln Memorial in an open-topped UFC-branded bus, I spoke by phone to Brendan Ballou, a former federal prosecutor who now serves as executive director of a group that sued, unsuccessfully, to have the UFC White House event stopped. Ballou told me his issue was not with the idea of holding a sporting event at the president's home. "This is a case about corruption," he said. "This is a situation where the UFC and its parent company are selling sponsorship packages for $1 to $1.5 million per person, selling advertisements for companies like Crypto.com and Monster Energy drinks to run at the White House, giving exclusive streaming rights to Paramount, which is an ally of the president, and then having the president himself be personally invested in the company." According to public financial disclosures, Trump bought a small stake in TKO, the UFC's parent company, last March. I think the insider dealing angle might have been the strongest moral argument there was against holding the White House cage fight. More so than any president in U.S. history, Trump has turned his office into a personal money-making machine. He has also used his power to blatantly advance the interests of allies like the Ellison family, owners of CBS and Paramount, the UFC's exclusive U.S. broadcasting partners. Objecting to and fighting against anything that continues that trend strikes me as a perfectly legitimate stance to take. Let's move on now to a story from the world of travel. Excuse me. Now, this has the headline, "I returned to Quebec City, the last travel destination I ever shared with my beloved late father." And this is a special to the Star written by Linda Barnard. "When was the last time you were in Quebec City?" Tourism media representative Pascal Boivin asked me at a travel writers conference in January. I surprised both of us by crying. My father, Bill Brady, the broadcaster and world-traveling, food-loving writer who inspired my journalism career, had died just 2 months before, in late 2025. He was 93. Our final trip together was a father-daughter Quebec City jolly in spring 2024 to mark his 92nd birthday. In early 2024, Dad had announced he was taking a trip to Quebec City, alone. He envisioned adventure. I foresaw disaster for someone with mobility issues and a stubborn streak. So I decided to crash his solo plans and invited myself along. On that trip, we ate well, taking a bus tour to the farms of Ile d'Orléans, pardon my French, east of the city, and visiting La Grande Marche de Quebec, where they have free loaner wheelchairs at the entrance. Dad got to chat with his favorite people, cheese vendors. I hired private guide Serge Perron for a half-day of sightseeing in Vieux-Quebec. The retired history professor took us around by van. There were lots of interesting stops with limited walking. We rode the funicular down from Dufferin Terrace to Petit Champlain for an easy amble. Dad talked to everybody and worked on his French. J'ai 92. I'm 92, he declared, beaming at their reaction. Again, this reader apologizes for his French. This spring I returned to Quebec City, this time to write a food and travel story. I was edgy for weeks beforehand. The heritage quarter of Vieux-Quebec is a compact place. It was inevitable that I'd walk along the same cobblestone streets, passing cafes and landmarks my dad and I had visited with such joy. What if it was overwhelming? Grief proved to be a random thing. I walked around the graceful 400-year-old city, wrote notes, took photos, and fell into the pattern of work. When I sat down for a coffee at Place Royale, I remembered being at this cafe with Dad. Melancholy arrived with a sharp, fizzing feeling, like when you realize you've forgotten something important. Then it slipped into the background. I cried just once when I passed the hotel where we stayed and went inside. My father became my shadow companion, there but not present. We laughed on this bench near Rue du Trésor over his lunch order of poutine and a milkshake. I saw him in his smart floral shirt and ball cap, resting his cane against his thigh to take a picture with his smartphone. I had a photo of his grin when the waiter poured us a complimentary after-dinner port. Food was my dad's love language, especially with me and my sister, Laura, a chef and hobby farmer. One of the first things he'd ask when I got home from a trip was, "What did you eat?" On this Quebec City trip, I mentally told Dad everything I ate. Can you believe they grow saffron in Charlevoix, an hour from here? The chef made faux salmon caviar with it at Bistro Origine for the walleye ceviche. The venison tartare was brilliant at La Clan, the restaurant in the pretty white house where we almost went for dinner that evening. They're celebrating their first Michelin star. In my mind, I described to him every one of the dishes on the 16-course chef's tasting meal at Tanière Trois, the 2 Michelin-starred restaurant in Vieux-Quebec. They even served a pre-dessert, creme brulee made with sweet candy cat mushrooms topped with salty sturgeon caviar. I could hear Dad's reply, "You don't say." I'm not surprised that grief travel is becoming popular, whether it's visiting a healing retreat or a place one shared with or significant to a loved one. I found comfort in being back where we were as father and daughter. We made memories together then. I made new memories on my return. My dad was doing his own grief travel on our trip. My mom, Mary Ann, died in 2022. She was his travel companion for 67 years of marriage, always game to go where his wanderlust led. "Mom and I stayed here," he said, as we passed the handsome Fairmont Le Chateau Frontenac. We posed for a photo in the lobby, then went up to the exclusive Fairmont Gold floor of the hotel. The woman at the desk let us in so Dad could admire the views of the St. Lawrence River and the historic Dufferin Terrace below. After Dad died, I found a piece he wrote in 2015 for his regular column in the London Free Press. So he gets the last word here. In many other lands, death is but a stage of life. Relationships do not end. There is never what we think of as closure. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. On to some relationships advice. And this comes from advice columnist Lisi Tesher. And today's headline is, "I'm a dental hygienist with a terrible gag reflex. Will I have to change careers?" Ask Lisi. And the question: I'm a dental hygienist with a real problem. I have a very strong olfactory sense and a quick gag reflex. The combination usually doesn't cause me any issues until recently. I just switched offices and have 3 new patients with absolutely horrific breath. The first time I got close to one of the patients, I went right in, got a whiff, and had to run out of the room to vomit. I sent myself home with the excuse of potential food poisoning, but I knew what had happened. The second patient was still in the waiting room when I smelled her breath, and I was able to switch with another hygienist. The third patient was mildly offensive, and I was able to curb my gag reflex. How do I deal with this when these people will be coming in every 6 months? Signed, Halitosis. Lisi's answer: I spoke with a dental hygienist, and she highly recommended switching to the N95 masks from the pre-COVID level 1 masks of old. The N95 masks are now the standard. They're thicker and better at keeping out germs, while disallowing odors to penetrate as much. She also told me she knew some people who would put Listerine strips in their mask to scent up the mask, thus protecting themselves from patients with odorific mouths. Of course, if the odor is dental related, the dentist should be able to address that. Better brushing techniques, flossing, tongue scraping, and oral rinses are a good start. But often, bad breath comes from non-dental issues like sinus infection or postnasal drip, medications, chronic acid reflux, or from the gut. And that's beyond a dentist's scope. And our next question for Lisi. My sister begged my mom for a new pair of shoes the entire winter. My mom continuously said no because she knew my sister would wear them in the snow and slush and ruin them quickly. My sister didn't stop the full court press for these shoes, so my mom finally gave in and bought them for my sister. I'm not exaggerating when I tell you that the very next day she wore them in the rain without having sprayed them with any weather protector, legit because they're not weather shoes, and ruined them. Now they're stained and discolored, and she refuses to wear them. My mom is so mad. So I asked my sister if I could have them, and she said yes. I spent a few weeks meticulously cleaning them, brushing them, and even took them to a shoe specialist to ask him what to do on my own. Now they look great, and, you guessed it, my sister wants them back. But they're mine now, and now everyone is fighting. Help! Signed, Soul Sister. And Lisi's answer, you're not going to like my answer, but I hope you show it to your mom. You have proven to be very thoughtful and careful with your belongings. You put in the effort and time to make your sister's cast-offs look better. She gave them to you, and you deserve to keep them. However, it sounds to me as though she's not going to back down. So if you and your mom want some peace in the home, I suggest you give this pair back to your sister. Hopefully your mom will reward your behavior and buy you something you've been eyeing, whether it's another pair of these same shoes or something else that matters to you. But this is a one-off situation, which I'm sure your mom has noted. I doubt she'll be buying your sister something of this quality again soon. And now some feedback regarding the April 15th Lisi column regarding the teenagers' clothing. And a comment from a reader, teens rebel. What are her friends wearing? That would be a significant indicator, as peer pressure is huge. But I would take a step back and look at the big picture. Her daughter is still involved in family events and spending time with her grandparents. That's a huge blessing. Be careful not to push her away. If this is their main concern regarding their daughter, they're doing quite well. What is more important, what she wears when she's with family, or just being with family? And a comment from reader 2, Dear Mom, please be ever so thankful your daughter attends these family events. Avoid majoring in minors and celebrate her in the occasion. And Lisi's final comment, I agree being with family is more important than what their daughter is wearing. It sounds to me as though her presence isn't in question, which is why they're able to focus on her clothing. And finally today, another news article, and the headline is $24 for a corn dog and pop. Fans are hit with high concession prices at FIFA Fan Fest. And this comes from Amarachi Amadike, staff reporter for the Star. Walter Solari stood near the food vendors at FIFA Fan Fest, wondering whether the bedazzled corn dog in his hand was worth the $24 he just coughed up. It's crazy, he said. It came with a pop, but it's so expensive. Across the grounds there were sporadic murmurs from other frustrated soccer fans complaining about the overpriced food menu. A popsicle, for example, was priced at $8 before tax. To get a regular poutine or a medium-sized jerk chicken, FanFest attendees had to pay at least $20. If you want my honest opinion, it's a lot, and they're still asking for a tip, said Eric Garcia, who was at the FanFest to support Mexico on opening day. Another fan who was about to devour a small hot dog he says he paid around $15 for called the prices ridiculous, though his friend admitted such prices were expected. While one vendor told the Star that prices at the FanFest, which he says are higher than what he would regularly charge, were not set by individual sellers, city staff say otherwise. Food vendors established their own prices for food offerings at FIFA Fan Festival Toronto, a city spokesperson said in an email statement to the Star, reversing an earlier statement that host cities set the prices for food and beverages. Things were no better at Toronto Stadium during Canada's home opener. Prices included chicken tenders and fries at $25, $7 bottles of water, and more options for expensive poutine. To acquire the flagship Visa cardholder combo, 2 foot-long hot dogs and 2 pops, fans had to pay about $60 after taxes. To some, however, this was just par for the course. Every time you go to a sporting event of any kind, it's going to be pretty expensive, Brad Thompson said during Canada's home opener on Friday. At Rogers Stadium, spectators experienced similar prices for bottles of water to those being charged at FIFA FanFest, while cheaper beer options can start at around $15. Still, many are taken aback by pricing trends at FIFA World Cup events. A recent analysis of host city pricing highlighted that beer prices at World Cups have steadily increased over the past 5 tournaments, with the 2026 tournament on track to set new records. The findings highlight a growing gap between everyday city prices and the cost of the matchday experience, said Players Time data analyst Alexandra Dimitrova. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the June 19th issue of the Toronto Star. Your reader has been Phil Tomczak. Thank you for listening.